I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar. This is brought to you by University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the Illinois Rural Development Council. My name is Ann Silvis, and I'm with University of Illinois Extension, and I also serve on the board of directors for Rural Partners. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping details I'd like to share. For one, we have so many people on the line. We want you to please mute your mic and stop your video. That'll help us with the bandwidth. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat space. If you have difficulty with the audio, post those questions in the chat space and we'll provide some technical assistance after we get going. And we are recording this webinar, and that will be available later on our website, and you'll get an email when that's ready. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us for this jointly sponsored webinar, Rural Partners and University of Illinois Extension. And now I'd like to introduce Laura Hep-Kessel, who will moderate today's session. And Laura is the Director of Telehealth Services for Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. And Laura is also currently serving as Chair of the Board of Directors for Rural Partners. So thank you, Laura, for serving as our moderator today.
Thank you. I would like to welcome everyone to the second in a series of webinars co-hosted by the University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, and a special thanks to Extension for hosting. As Ann said, I'm Laura Hep-Kessel, Chair of Rural Partners and Director of Telehealth at SIU School of Medicine. In case you're not familiar with Rural Partners, we are a membership-driven, not-for-profit with diverse representation on our board and in our general membership. We welcome your engagement, and you can learn more at the Rural Partners website. We are currently accepting membership dues for 2021 in case you're interested in joining us. Our next webinar in this series is scheduled for January 2021 and will be focused on telehealth. I'm now going to welcome my friend, Dr. John Jackson from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura and Ann. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here today with you to talk about this quite interesting, I think, election and perhaps the aftermath of it, although the aftermath does go on. And I must admit, the fact that it goes on has made this a bit of a challenge to put together this lecture and to make sense out of whatever I was going to say when I agreed to do this, thinking that it would all be over by now. Obviously, it's not quite all over, but we're going to make the analysis based on the assumption that President-elect is Joe Biden. I was obviously going to do a much different treatment if it had been a re-election of the president. The Chicago Tribune on Sunday before the election had a headline that I thought was appropriate. It said, "Campaign season unlike any other nears its finish." A lot of us would add, thank goodness, to that. The headline succinctly captured the essence of this campaign, although it was a considerable understatement to say unlike any other. I would say indeed to that. The headline writer, of course, was referring to the COVID virus, the omnipresent impact that it had on this campaign and election and on the economy in general, and certainly on all of our individual lives. The virus as a threat is still growing and is still very much with us at the time of the November 3rd vote and continues, of course, we all know, through this day. Add to that was the civil unrest that beset us. It started, of course, on May the 25th with Memorial Day when George Floyd was tragically killed on the street in Minneapolis. Several other African Americans were either killed or injured after that, and that whole thing set off a season of tremendous civil unrest, particularly in the spring and the summer, and it extended even into the fall. At first, there were widespread and initially peaceful demonstrations. The Black Lives Matter group got going, and unfortunately, some of those turned out to be violent at the end, with both demonstrators and police officers getting injured. Fires were set and there was some looting. I watched all this happen in 1968, which is the only other campaign and election that I think is even remotely comparable to this one. And it had a kind of a familiar touch to it because we'd had the so-called long hot summers of 1967 and 1968 at that time. 68 started, as you may remember, some of you will be from your history books, of course, first Lyndon Johnson said on 31st of May that he would not run for re-election. Then tragically, Dr. King was killed in Memphis in April, and Senator Kennedy, who had just won the California primary, was killed in June. And then we had the Chicago Democratic National Convention, which nominated Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon and Humphrey slugged it out until the fall, when Humphrey, of course, was defeated by Nixon. So sometimes I think this is comparable to that, but I think this is even a more difficult season than that one, because we had a campaign and election fought out in what was already a deeply polarized nation. From the start of the campaign, we've had some of the most conflicted times since the turn of the 21st century that the nation's ever faced. Donald Trump took office with a divided nation. We're divided by race, region, religion, class, and especially partisanship and ideology. That division, of course, is underscored by the fact that the president carried the Electoral College vote, and Hillary Clinton carried the popular vote and carried it by almost 2 million votes. And so that epitomized and exacerbated the divisions that were already there. And I think, frankly, that Trump's style has exacerbated those divisions. His constant use of Twitter, which he has pioneered and used more effectively as the bully pulpit than any other predecessor ever even thought about doing. I think his style, his actions, his words, and the constant barrage of criticizing those who opposed him and attacking those who crossed him in any way has added to that polarization. And his critics and opposition responded in kind fairly often. All of that culminated with the start of this year. Just think back to January. It's hard to remember back to January, but January started with impeachment. It was the first time for an impeachment of a sitting president who was running for a second term. There have been 3 other impeachment possibilities, and a total of 3 impeachments, counting Trump and counting Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, of course. That alone got us off to a rocky start. And then, of course, all that came later that I alluded to a few minutes ago. So who knew it was going to work out that way? 2020 has really been one of those rocky years in American political history. I think in some ways, in answer to my rhetorical question of what happened and why, which I want to discuss, this election looked a good deal like 2016 in its outcomes, although it took four days to settle it this time. And in real respect, it's not settled yet because the president and some of his supporters are charging that the election is being stolen and that the Democrats are trying to steal it by the vote count. There, of course, are lawsuits already being filed. And yesterday, Attorney General Barr was authorizing his federal prosecutors to look into questions and charges of vote fraud. So that really goes on. And the election was close enough that up through even the first 2 days of the count, there was a real possibility that we were going to get another split like the 2016 split, where we got an electoral college vote for Donald Trump and a popular vote margin of some magnitude for Joe Biden. And so that possibility was very real up to about Thursday of this past week. If this had happened, it of course would have been even more like 2016, and it would have been somewhat like 2000 as well. 2000, it took 34 days for us to finally get a winner. But if that had happened, it would have meant that 3 out of the 6 elections held in the 21st century would have gone that way. 3 out of 6, of course, is 50-50. And I would contend that would have been a particularly unfortunate outcome for this campaign and election, because the divisions would have been exacerbated, the conflict would have been exacerbated. We hold elections to provide legitimacy to the winner, so the winner can take office and to govern. And there would have been, as there were in 16 and in 2000, tens of millions of people who would have felt like their vote didn't count for anything. So that one didn't happen, and I think we dodged a bullet, and I'm certainly relieved that that is the case, because I think I had actually talked before the election in several lectures that I gave about how that would have been a particularly unfortunate outcome that was really looming at that time. So in spite of the fact that we dodged the bullet, we still got divided government out of this past campaign and election. Campaign was close, and the votes in many of the states, many with critical elections at the congressional level, were very close elections, lots of toss-ups, but the outcome left the Senate under the control of the Republicans, I think almost certainly. That promises to make Biden getting legislation passed and any new programs extremely difficult to bring off. The legislative gridlock that we saw in Illinois, for example, in 15 and 16, and that we've been seeing at the national level really for years, and especially since the 2018 midterm elections, will be repeated in my estimations, although the presidency has obviously shifted from Republican to Democrat, because the Republicans will continue to control the Senate. So that division is with us, as I mentioned. Where you live, your residency, which by the way is nicely depicted on those 2 maps that we had prepared, one for the national map and one for the state of Illinois, because those 2 maps illustrate exactly the same point. That is, where you live has a lot to do with how you see the world and how you see politics and how you behave politically. And what we get, of course, is that red state, blue state phenomenon that we've all become so accustomed to that we don't realize that it's only been with us a couple of decades. But nevertheless, that red state, blue state division is clearly evident, and the rural versus urban split that it represents is clearly evident on that map for the nation. And if you look at the Illinois map, it's the exact same thing. We get a very red county, blue county split in the outcome of this election. That red county, blue county split has been with us forever in Illinois politics and has probably gotten worse and has gotten to be more of a division geographically than it ever was before, especially because the differences and the changes in Southern Illinois, for one thing, those divisions grew in this campaign and election. And we're all familiar with that fact that where you live determines so much of your political outlook. It's been consistent in Illinois, and it's been consistent in the nation for quite a long time. And those divisions, I think, again, the things that were happening that were important backdrops were exacerbated by our response to the pandemic, our reactions to what we ought to do about it as a nation and as a state. Simple things like the wearing of a mask and the practicing of social distancing got to be a very political and a very partisan discussion and conflict, and even led to some violence. A couple of poor folks that were trying to enforce the rules at Walmart got attacked because they suggested somebody wear a mask before they enter a Walmart store. So you're all familiar with those divisions, and in the heat of the battle, I think they've continued and have grown in the relationship between how we see our campaigns and how we see our stakes in the way we judge our candidates. So based on both the polling that happened before and the polling that was done as exit polls on election day, as well as the aggregate voting returns, I'm going to try to draw some generalizations about what happened and why it happened. Again, geographical division is probably the most important of all when it comes to the Electoral College. But sort of put in gross anatomy terms, the Republicans and the conservatives voted for President Trump, and the Democrats and the liberals voted for Joe Biden. And overwhelmingly, the pre-election polls indicated that that number was going to be above 90%. So there were no real surprises there. The independents split their vote, but went disproportionately for Biden, and that helped him a lot. And it was an important factor in his building the coalition that he was able to build. The rural areas, of course, went for President Trump, and they went overwhelmingly for President Trump. Now, that part of the equation is not a surprise. It's been longstanding. Of course, everybody knew to expect that. What was a surprise was how heavily the rural areas turned out to vote. I think to the extent there's going to be a critique of the polling, there is one place you can look to where the polls may have once again had trouble and where they may have had some problems representing just how heavy the turnout in the rural areas was going to be. But Trump and his campaign very effectively mobilized and energized the voters in those rural areas. They apparently recruited a lot of first-time voters, and those first-time voters disproportionately turned out for the president. They used two quite different strategies at the national campaigns, but the Republicans stressed getting out the vote in the traditional ways of going and knocking on doors and asking people to vote for them. And they did that very effectively, and that made a difference in those rural areas for the president. The urban areas, not surprisingly, voted very heavily for Joe Biden. And the story is the same story there in a sense. That is, turnout was up. Turnout was up phenomenally. This being the biggest turnout in American history since the election of 1900 on the percentage, and ever if you look at just the number of raw votes. Joe Biden got more votes for president than any other candidate in American history. And Donald Trump got more votes than any second place finisher in history. We're going to be at a record breaking turnout percentage, probably about 65%. 60% has been considered pretty phenomenal. And in 2016, it was 58%. So that turnout question was critical to what happened, but it was turnout on both sides. In the case of the Democrats, they stressed more the digital campaign because of the COVID. They did not do what Democrats usually do extensively. They did not campaign door to door nearly as much as the Republicans did. but they depended on social media. And to an extent, surprising perhaps, that also worked for them, but that was two quite different approaches. Number three, the suburbs voted for Biden. That was absolutely key for Joe Biden. And in some respects, it is key to the future of this country because the suburban areas are where the people live. They hold the balance of power, and that balance of power in both 16 and 18, or 16 and 20, voted for the Democratic candidate overwhelmingly, disproportionately, which is a marked change from the way suburban areas were even at the turn of the century in this country. And of course, key to that were the suburban women, because both in 16 and 20, suburban women voted very heavily for Joe Biden. So that's absolutely where the future lies, both in the case of the nation and in the case of the state of Illinois. Certainly, if you look at those collar counties, it's just unheard of that 2 elections in a row, all of them except McHenry, have gone for the Democratic candidate. And if anybody's taken a look at DuPage County returns, for example, they are absolutely amazing. For those of us that remember Pate Phillip and the powerhouse that DuPage County used to be in Republican politics in this state. In addition, there were the top two issues that I've already brought up. Number one was the issue of the economy, and a close second was the issue of the pandemic and how to handle the virus. And they split the voters into Republican and Trump camps and Democrat and Biden camps. Those who thought the economy was the most important issue voted for Trump overwhelmingly, and probably voted for those down ballot races on the Senate, especially overwhelmingly as well, although I haven't seen the data that indicate that. Those who thought the virus was the most important issue and that we had to get it under control before we could address the economic problems voted again overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. So in conclusion for that, the appeal to the base worked. It clearly worked to mobilize the base in those geographical areas pretty much as predicted, except for the fact that the turnout was absolutely not predicted to be quite as heavy as it was. The president especially focused his campaign almost exclusively on the base. If you watch those rallies that he held in person, many of those held in the last month when the virus was growing and the president was campaigning personally. His favorite mode of campaigning, and if you listen to his rhetoric, it was white hot rhetoric about the economy, about the need to get the economy open, and the appeal that he made to sort of the law and order narrative, which he adopted based on the events of the summer, particularly the threats to the suburbanites, that they were no longer safe, and that Biden would bring in all kinds of people that were going to storm the suburbs, that we would have socialism, illegals, loss of jobs, loss of our guns, and so forth. And president's narrative worked, obviously, for 70 million people. So that's not to be sneezed at. It was effective up to a remarkable level. Biden's appeal was also made to traditional Democratic Party supporters, the base on his side. He particularly stressed the need for continuing and building up and changing the Affordable Care Act. Healthcare was the number one narrative that Biden pursued, but he also had to deal with progressive issues that he might not have preferred to deal with otherwise. The progressives like Senator Sanders and Senator Warren were a huge factor in his appeal and his thinking in terms of how to manage them and how to manage what has been a traditional split in the Democratic Party between the more moderate and more pragmatic, I would say, and the more progressive elements on the other side. Biden undoubtedly appreciated that he had to straddle those two divisions and try to bring them back together, because he knew, and undoubtedly a student of history, any of you would know, that it's been when Democrats won, they won because they were able to bring those two factions together. Most notably, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had done that effectively, and they are the only two-term presidents for the Democrats since the end of World War II. At times, Joe Biden got in trouble trying to do this. For example, you had to wait till the end of the third debate, and most people weren't probably still watching at that time, when Joe Biden made a mistake that almost cost him Pennsylvania, when he talked about fracking and getting a cap put on oil production. And he had to try to walk it back before he got to the car, and then tried to walk it back the next day. But I've heard from friends who have friends in Western Pennsylvania who indicate that almost cost him Pennsylvania right there. And so he made some mistakes occasionally. He was not always able to bring those two groups together, but nevertheless, he effectively mobilized the base before it was all over. The undecideds, I think it remains to be seen what appealed to them. First of all, there were relatively few undecideds to start with. It was phenomenal. There was something like 16% undecided in the last 10 days of the Clinton campaign in 2016. And she had the misfortune that most of those broke for Donald Trump at the end. The undecideds, I think, were probably influenced this time by especially the COVID issue. Aside from that, though, in the rural areas, which we're all here today very interested in, I think the key for the president there was the fact that the Trump administration had been hurt by both the trade war with China and the tariffs that he used in order to prosecute that war. Others of us, American consumers, were hurt by those tariffs as well, and hurt by the COVID impact on the farmers and their production of food, for example, and particularly their production of food chains that went to the restaurants in big cities, for example, and just to our shelves in places like Carbondale at times where there were shortages. But keep in mind, the Trump administration funneled a total of $61 billion in direct payments to the farmers and the ranchers over the last 2 years, counting this year. And there was $46 billion of direct payments this year alone. Most of that money went to the Midwest and to the South, and Trump just mopped up on having done that. There's no question in my mind, at least, but what he would have been in a lot more trouble in places like Iowa and rural Illinois if it hadn't been for that massive amount of subsidy that was made in terms of direct payments to farmers and ranchers. I bring up that too to indicate that I am somewhat skeptical about whether or not those direct payments and those subsidies will continue under a new administration and a new Congress. It depends, in my estimation, on whether or not the Republicans in Congress rediscover the deficit. And with the Democrat in office, they're now afraid of the deficit again, which certainly they've not been before, and typically are not so worried about the deficit when the Democrats are in the White House. But you have to look at the Senate and the treatment of the last stimulus package, which failed because the Republicans in the Senate said that they did not want to do any more deficit financing of a new stimulus package, or certainly didn't do anything more than what the Senate was suggesting, which was under $1 trillion. So keep an eye on that. Midwestern farmers and Southern farmers have done well under the Trump administration. The Biden administration may want to be likewise as generous to them, but I'm skeptical that the Senate will want to do the same thing. Now I want to take a deep breath and shift gears into sort of a part two and talk a bit in that same vein about what happened in Illinois. And then we'll come back again to the nation plus Illinois in part three. The long and short in Illinois is the Democrats did less well than was expected to be their fate. The latest figures I have, and I think these are going to stand up, or if they don't, they'll be off by one. But it looks like the Democrats lost 2 in the House and they won 1 seat in the Senate. The one that they picked up, I understand, is the Jim Oberweis district on the outskirts of Chicago. They had hoped to do better than that, and there were some indications that they might. And I'm sure they're disappointed, and certainly there's already criticism, particularly in the House, about how badly they did in the House races. Judge Kilbride was a prominent question on the retention, and the Democrats lost that seat on the court, and that could turn out to be a very critical loss in terms of changing the margin on the court. In Southern Illinois, the last remaining Democratic legislator, Representative Nathan Wrights, lost in the 116th, which includes where Laura and I are from. And in the courthouses throughout Southern Illinois, the Republicans just cleaned up, with the exception of my county of Jackson County. In the Metro East area, the Democrats lost another one in a district that is the 111th, centered in Madison County. There, the incumbent, Monica Bristow, lost to Amy Illick. And those were the 2 losses. The Republicans, as I understand it currently, will go from 44 to 46 seats, perhaps even 47. Probably the biggest loss of all, however, and probably the most important in the long term, was the governor's loss on his signature program, the graduated income tax referendum. The governor originated that. He pressed hard for it. He backed it with $50 million worth of campaign ads, which were matched by Ken Griffith and lots of other billionaires that backed the opposition ads as well. Governor put his prestige on the line, and he went down to defeat by a 55 to 45% margin. I thought it would be close, but I think this is a surprisingly large defeat, and it makes the second 2 years of Governor Pritzker's term much more difficult for him to get important policies passed, and especially, most notably, for him to deal with the whole outcome in terms of the graduated income tax and what it does to the budget, because that's going to take really hard choices. On a more positive side, I think the fact that there are 2 Congress seats that were very closely fought, and yet, at least as of now, it looks like the Democrat has won in the Laura Underwood seat, and she almost lost that one. And in the congressional election, will come out with a status quo there. And Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by a healthy margin, although not quite the same margin that basically Hillary Clinton demonstrated her power in her native state of Illinois with in 2016. What happened in all of that, though? Mixed bag for the Democrats, but more negative than they had expected to be. Well, I think the explanation for that is the Republicans very effectively nationalized all the races, didn't matter what they were, from county courthouse on up to the White House, but particularly in those state races, and particularly on the graduated income tax. They nationalized the races with respect to getting all kinds of the usual suspects as the national threats. And I saw lots of ads that featured Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez as the face of the Democratic opposition. Didn't make any difference whether they were really relevant to that race or not. The ads used them. And of course, they used Michael Madigan, and that worked quite well for them. That strategy has left now the Democratic Party in some internal conflict at the highest levels because of those losses. Last week, we saw, I think, unprecedented decisions by both senators to come out and say that it was time for the speaker to no longer be also the Democratic Party chair. And some even went so far as to say that it was time for him to no longer be speaker. They had already a handful of House members saying that and going on record saying that they would not vote for the speaker in caucus in January, although it remains to be seen how strong that movement is. But nevertheless, there is division, deep division and deep public division among the leadership. And of course, the governor also weighed in with the same position that the two senators had taken. I thought back through my memory of Illinois politics, which goes back to Richard Ogilvie when I moved here. And the only thing comparable to this is in 1975, 1976, when Democrat Dan Walker was governor of Illinois and had been governor since 72 when he beat Paul Simon in the primary and beat Richard Ogilvie in the general election. And let us put it gently to say that Dan Walker was held in low esteem by his Democratic colleagues, particularly in the General Assembly and particularly Mayor Daley in the Chicago mayor's office. He had lots of internal divisions by 1976 primary, and he was beaten. Most of you are too young to know this or have any reason to have studied it in history, perhaps. But Mike Hallett beat Dan Walker in the Democratic primary. And then Mike Hallett went on to lose to Jim Thompson pretty handily in the general election. What is notable about this is it not only set off Jim Thompson's 14 years, I believe it was, as governor of Illinois, but then an unbroken stretch where for 26 straight years, you had a Republican in the governor's office, Jim Thompson, then Jim Edgar, then George Ryan. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not predicting that outcome for the Democrats and certainly not for the governor in 2022 when he's got to run again. I don't necessarily think the divisions are going to lead to 26 years worth of Republican governors in Illinois. But nevertheless, the defeat of the graduated income tax has been seismic in terms of the very large budget problem that we already had in Illinois. And every one of us is going to feel the impact, either directly or indirectly. The Pritzker administration had a plan with the graduated income tax, and it was the only plan on the table. And it absolutely could have addressed the budget problem because it had the promise that it was going to create some new revenue, estimated at $3.1 to $3.5 billion. That plan is gone now, and that prospective new revenue is gone now. And the problems are going to begin rather immediately. I'm absolutely confident that the people who make and sell those giant municipal bond issues in the New York bond houses have taken note. They know what happens in Illinois on things like this, and it's going to be much harder in terms of Illinois selling its bonds and what they have to pay in terms of the amount of interest and the rate of interest. We already had problems, even if the graduated income tax had passed. Now that it's failed, what comes next? The governor's already warning last Wednesday that the possibility for asking for a new tax increase is there. He issued that warning even before the election if it didn't pass. What I found notable about the campaign against the graduated income tax illustrates a larger problem in Illinois and in the nation, but certainly in Illinois, with regard to the way people understand budgets and the way they react to the possibility of new revenues. That is, the people who are critics were rarely asked, in my estimation, by the media, what would they do and what was their plan. And when they asked, their answer was get rid of waste and fraud. And that waste and fraud has been out there forever. However, when we went through 2015 and 2016, we found out that our budget's really pretty bare bones already. In our Simon Pose, which we've asked these questions consistently since 2008, we've consistently asked, where would you like to get some new revenue? And if you don't want to get new revenue, where would you make cuts in terms of programs? And then we give them a long list of programs and state services. And the answers are schizophrenic. Very few, very low numbers of people will endorse raising new revenue through tax increases. But then when we go down through that list of services and public goods that the state provides, very small numbers of people will want to do those as well, even for programs that don't necessarily benefit them directly. The numbers of people who want them cut are really remarkably small. We have in political science a concept that's long been operational when it comes to public opinion. That concept is that the American people, and certainly I think the people of Illinois, are what are called symbolic conservatives and operational liberals. That is, they want low taxes. They don't want any new tax increases and new revenue increases whatsoever. And yet they also don't want any cuts. Parenthetically, the cuts that we found to be the most popular were number one, to public pensions, and number two, to universities. I didn't much like either of those answers, but they were still the two most popular options across all of the years between 2008 and 2020, when we've done these questionnaires in our Paul Simon polling operation. So if you look back at the impact of the 2015 and 2016 budget impasse, I've been doing some research with a colleague of mine named John Foster, and we've pretty carefully found and documented in a paper that we're working on but not released yet, that the three big losers were the universities, state government agencies and their personnel budgets in particular, which is, of course, the phrase is the hollowing out of the state government, and those nonprofits and NGOs who serve the state's needs, particularly for the most vulnerable of our populations. That's where the money came from when we lost the income and when we lost on the reduction of the state tax increase that had been in place. And that, I think, is a very likely prospect again. There's going to be all kinds of problems with respect to getting state services done if you continue to take down the number of employees. For example, it seems to me the state's treatment of, and to some extent, difficulties with, and critics would say bungling of, the growth in unemployment insurance payments and trying to get that online rapidly in the wake of the COVID-19 environment. That I think illustrates the problems with the idea that we can just cut our way to addressing this budget. We had a problem, and now I think the problem's about to get worse. So stay tuned on Illinois government. I think we're going to see some difficult times, and I shudder to think they're going to be visited on the universities because I have self-interest there, as do many of us, but nevertheless, that's what happened in the last time around. All right, that's my bit for Illinois. I'll be happy to come back to that in question and answer sessions, which of course we are going to have presently, but this gets to part 3, a shift back to the national government. But I want to draw out the implications of that narrative back to the state of Illinois when I get to it. I want to ask and try to answer what will be the Biden administration's top policy objectives and what are the chances that they're likely to get through, get those proposals that they will make enacted into law if the Congress is involved. Again, first of all, the basics, we've obviously got divided government once again. You'll notice if you're following this carefully that I've given away the 2 races in Georgia. I think that's unlikely pickups for the Democrats, just in case you were wondering. I think the division in the Congress will probably be even more bitterly divided if we're not very careful. And I hope that's not the case, because we can't really afford for those deep set partisan divisions and lack of compromise and lack of ability to let the legislative process run in normal order, as it's called in the Congress, which it's not been doing for years. In short, the divided Congress represents a divided nation rather faithfully, it seems to me. The aftermath of that election found the president pouring more doubt and scorn on the counting of the returns, and that's going to continue in terms of mistrust and bad blood and the bitterness in the Congress if they are not very, very careful. We'll see how that all plays out with these lawsuits and with that continuing to be supported by some members, very prominent members actually, of the US Senate and the US House. The challenge for Biden is going to be to get the legislature and the Congress to work with him. And he is, of course, a veteran of the Congress. He claims he can do that. He claims that he and Mitch McConnell are friends, but I think it's going to be tough. Now, I hasten to add, I think it's going to be tough, but not impossible. I think there may be some things that they can do to compromise. And second, keep in mind that there's an enormous array of things the president can do without the Congress. Both Barack Obama and Donald Trump proved that. Both, for example, expanded the range and the use of executive orders. That's the one thing they were similar about. And they both expanded the power of the presidency in that area. And as you probably know, the president has especially wide range options and power in dealing with foreign and defense policy. So I think most immediately you're going to see a President Biden do a number of things that he can do unilaterally. For example, he's already announced that he wants to rejoin the Paris agreements on climate change. He's talked about repairing our relationships with NATO and our traditional allies. He's talked about trying to strengthen the other international institutions that the U.S. was key in building over the time since the end of World War II. look at the alphabet soup agencies, the WHO, the European Union or the EU, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, maybe even reviving the talk about the TPP or Trans-Pacific Pact, which would have been all of the Asian nations except for China. All of that will be on his agenda. In shorthand terms, when we teach international relations, we talk about the two polar ends of the continuum being isolationism and internationalism. You're going to see American foreign and defense policy return to internationalism in short order. And he's already talking about both the use of executive orders and the use of American diplomacy to do that. And there will be more impact on diplomacy, it seems to me, in a Biden administration. On the domestic front, I think the top four are: number one, a stimulus package. Joe Biden will advocate for a not large new stimulus package. The Democrats in the Congress and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, have all announced that they want a stimulus package. The House even passed one a couple of times because they're convinced that the economic recovery is likely to be much slower and any recession much more persistent and deeper without another stimulus package. And a lot of economists agree with that. So we will see how the Congress reacts, especially what the Senate might do. But that's a big one. Among others, it's a big one for us here in Illinois, because the Democrats have made plain that they won't have a stimulus package that leaves out state and local government. That was one of the sticking points, because McConnell, and depending on when he was speaking, sometimes Trump was opposed and sometimes he was for that. But at times, the Trump administration was trying to help get that done. I also think it's notable that the Illinois Municipal League, under the leadership of Brad Coe, who, by the way, is Carbondale's former mayor, has advocated for that. And they represent all of the cities and towns and municipalities throughout the state, as their name implies. I bring the Illinois Municipal League into this argument because that represents the mayors, the city councils, the county. They don't represent the county boards, but other public officials throughout Illinois who are in very Republican areas. Look again at that predominantly red part of Illinois when you look at the red counties of Illinois. Those are folks who've been impacted by the loss of revenue because of the pandemic needs, and the first responders and what it's done to their hospital systems, and particularly what it's done to rural hospitals, by the way. And likewise, if you look at the national map, there are a lot of red state governors and red state legislators on that national map where you see that red. They need help with their budget problems. So I'm cautiously optimistic here that the members of Congress from those areas are going to hear from the people back home, and especially those opinion leaders and those public officials that are represented when the Illinois Municipal League and others say that we need some help from the federal government. So stay tuned, or as the president says, we shall see. Point number two is an infrastructure plan. I'm absolutely optimistic about this. I think we will get one very likely at the federal level. We of course got one at the state level in 2019. Trump had his own plan that he had introduced in 2018. However, it went nowhere because, number one, it called for an 80% contribution match from state and local government and the private sector being leveraged, and only 20% federal funds. As you may know, previous infrastructure bills had usually been roughly the opposite, 80-20 on the other way, or 75-25, or sometimes 50-50, depending on the legislation. But the local and state governments were not interested. And very quickly, the president lost interest. In fact, his emphasis on the infrastructure bill that he had introduced on the Hill lasted less than 1 week. And then he went on, and it really got no further attention. But there's a lot of people who want an infrastructure plan. Biden has endorsed an infrastructure plan. It would include, obviously, a lot of people in the rural areas on things that we count to be important. There, I think the emphasis on rural broadband has already been growing and has been somewhat successful, but it could be continued and even accelerated by a infrastructure plan that included broadband expansion and 5G capacity and so forth. And here, another thing that's important to the community colleges and the universities is such a plan will include workforce development if the unions have anything to do with it, and they surely will. Everyone agrees that we've got to educate the workforce for the 21st century jobs. Most everybody agrees that those are different kinds of jobs from some of the education that we're delivering. This will particularly impact both community colleges and in apprenticeship programs. I think also including especially healthcare workers. Point number 3 on the domestic front is to strengthen the the Affordable Care Act, popularly Obamacare. It's notable that today the Supreme Court takes up the question of whether or not to declare the ACA unconstitutional. I think that is a real possibility. If it gets saved, it may get saved because of the idea of severability, that the whole act doesn't have to fall at once. But I'm not convinced that will be saved in a court that is now 6-3. 20 million Americans have a stake in that ruling that begins today and has probably already begun in Washington in front of the Supreme Court. Joe Biden has said that he will support a public option, but that he would also protect private insurance, a place where he parted with the more left part of his party who wanted Medicare for all. I think those who get their insurance from their jobs are likely to be able to keep it no matter what the Congress does, because I can't see them making any changes in this. But by the way, rural hospitals are going to have a significant stake in how that conversation all comes out, because they are so much involved with the Affordable Care Act. Point number 4 is to pare back the tax cuts of 2017, especially for the wealthy. What that actually means remains to be seen, but Joe Biden and the Democrats in Congress have constantly been calling for this. Again, some of the advocacy of the Warren Sanders wing of the party. This could be a source of some fairly significant revenue. But again, the question is, are members of Congress actually concerned about the federal deficit? And so far lately, the answer has been no. Closely related, number 5 is the issue of the environment. I think that the whole Democratic Party is probably in support of doing more to deal with the question of cutting carbon emissions. The whole Paris Accords were about that. I think the whole party will go pretty heavily toward doing something. What exactly, for example, the Green New Deal means remains to be seen, and the devil is in the detail as the Congress tries to work that out. But I think that is going to be a very hard sell for many members of the Republican part of the Congress. And then I want to talk very briefly about presidential power, especially executive orders, but beyond that. You may not remember this, but Attorney General Barr advocated something he called the unitary president theory. And he advocated that in letter or column in the Washington Post, he basically said that there are no real limits on the power of the president except impeachment and the next election. Well, Biden's going to go around the Congress in order to get by the Senate at times. So how that works out will be an important contribution to the issue of just how big is presidential power and what does it amount to. I think that is going to be interesting to see whether or not he has an expansive view of presidential power, but I'm fairly confident that his view of presidential power will not be as expansive as Attorney General Barr's theory of presidential power has been. Number 7 I'm on now, Biden will start the project of rebalancing the federal courts by appointing Democrats. Whether he can get them to the Senate remains to be seen. And that's especially important at the district and appellate court levels. As you all know, the president has now appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, but he's also appointed more than 200 new federal judges at the lower levels. Surely Mitch McConnell can't wait until the next election to let some of those move through the Senate. And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And for this, finally, I want to highlight China and our trade and tariffs relationships with the Chinese government, because that is so important to the rural areas. Joe Biden was chair for a number of terms of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He knows foreign policy, and I think you'll see some real changes from the Trump administration approach. I do not think he will be enthusiastic about using tariffs to try to bend other nations to our will. It hasn't worked that well with China, so it's going to take a new reset on our relationships with China, and American consumers and American farmers have a great deal at stake in that one. All right, I'm heading toward conclusion, I promise. Get your questions and answers ready, because we'll take them shortly. His biggest challenge, Joe Biden's, is to help get people calm down and help get back to something like normalcy. The election's over, let's get on with it, will be roughly his message. I think fortunately for Biden and for the nation, he started talking about this during his campaign. One of his signature lines was, "I'm a Democrat, but I'm not going to be a Democratic president. I'm going to be the American president." In that speech Saturday night, he quoted Obama. We're not just the red states and the blue states, we're the United States. In that same speech, he said, "I want to be the president for all Americans, whether you voted for me or not." Quite apart from all of that, in my view, and you can insert editorial opinion at this point if you haven't already, we desperately need leaders who will start stressing what unites us, and that what unites us is more important than what divides us, because we've had too many leaders stressing what divides us. We used to expect our leaders to talk about our mutual interest, our mutual values, our stake in the nation's success. And we've had some of that same problem with Illinois leaders who stress sectionalism. We had 2 counties in Southern Illinois who voted for there to be 2 states made out of Illinois in this November 3rd election. And we've had the same thing happening in Central and Southern Illinois in the primary. We need leaders that say that what unites us should transcend party ultimately, should transcend region and race, and should be a part of what we learn about what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Because after all, most people benefit from stability and progress, and they can only come when we understand that the larger community is what's at stake here. Thomas Hobbes, who was one of the great social compact theorists, said, "Life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short." We've been all too close to nasty, brutish, and short at times. For example, I cite you two specific examples recently, one from each column. A kid who takes a weapon across state lines from northern Illinois into Kenosha, Wisconsin, and winds up killing two young men in the middle of what should have been a peaceful demonstration. Or number two, those who turned a peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstration, or even more than one demonstration in downtown Chicago, into an excuse to start a riot, and things led to looting and fires. We've got to have leaders who convincingly condemn such behavior on both sides of the equation. And we've got to have leaders who can devise effective solutions to our long-term problems, because we certainly have long-term problems of deep inequities, both in our economic and political systems, and discrimination and injustice in places like our judicial system. So those problems fester and they break out in what I think is anomic violence that leads to destruction, rather than advancing the cause of working towards solutions. In the words of the preamble to the Constitution, we need to elect leaders who will constantly seek to, quote, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The preamble to the Constitution seems a good place for me to quit and to let you have your say, and I'll be happy to hear from any of you. I'm going to have some direction about, I think Nancy's going to direct traffic from here on in, so let's have at it on Q&A and feedback, if we could, Nancy. Hello?
Laura is the moderator. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I missed that transition. Laura, okay.
Laura, you're muted right now. And I can jump in. There were several questions
Okay, fire
that were,
away.
sure, there were several questions in the chat box. The questions started early, which was really good to see people getting right in to it. So we had a question early on during your presentation. If Illinois did split the electoral votes, would it still be a blue state, or would it be part blue and part red? So it's a question about the split electoral votes.
Well, that's a good question. The best way I can take it is to look at the congressional delegation. And of course, the congressional delegation is whatever, let's see, it's going to come out the same. So there are what, 5 with no pickups. What is it now? Out of 18, there are, I'm blanking on that, but there are only 5 or 6 Republican districts now. So that, I think, would mean that we would be heavily blue, but the geography would be heavily red. I hope I didn't confuse that too much, but that map, keep that map that we were just looking at earlier in mind, and that would give you some answer to that question. Yeah, that map.
Thank you. And Laura, do you want to take over as moderator now, or you're muted still? Okay, let's see here.
Thank you, Nancy. They kept saying they're
Okay.
not unmute me.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. Sure. So sorry about that. I was going to just make a statement that sort of goes towards the end of Dr. Jackson's comments that someone included in the chat box. It says division is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the bitter part that is a problem. It doesn't allow for much compromise. Perhaps everyone in Congress and state legislature needs to read Kennedy's Profiles in Courage to find out how real leaders were able to bury personal feelings for the good of the nation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think division is absolutely a part of politics, but so is the ability to then work on negotiating in the legislative process, making compromises, working it through, the hard work of getting that done. And we've lost that ability to work the process as it's demanded by the Constitution. If you look at Madison's division of powers, separation of powers, checks and balances, that's precisely what he designed in the Constitution, but it absolutely required some moderation and some significant compromise, and that's what's been missing.
Someone mentioned that going back to the graduated income tax or fair tax or whatever we'd like to call it, that it was an especially bad defeat because it required a 60% vote. So
yeah, that's a long philosophical debate in my discipline about whether or not supermajorities are democratic, little d. I won't bore you with any of that, but to say that supermajorities are tough to achieve, and this was always going to be a tough slog for the governor's forces to get to that 60%.
Also a comment about the speakership and Speaker Madigan and how that is determined in caucus by a voice acclamation, not secret ballot. So Madigan will likely keep that position. So that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, that person's prospect view is certainly as good as mine. I don't know how to predict that. There have been a handful of state legislators saying they won't vote for the speaker again, but we'll see when push comes to shove.
There's some commentary about some local county races, and I don't think we need to get into that at this point, but someone said, I suspect that if higher levels of government were to take some lessons from township government, we wouldn't need to have higher taxes because township government, by and large, treats tax money as if it were a precious commodity and is used sparingly.
Yeah, that's a long debate in Illinois. Townships are, of course, we don't have townships governments in nearly all the counties, but the counties that have townships are very protective of them and very proud of them. And township government is grassroots government right close to the people. I live in Carbondale Township, and I'm a happy camper in terms of the way they take care of my needs. Obviously, that's a long debate, though, and a lot of people say that the counties could do it just as well. There have been a few successful movements, but very few on the whole government consolidation issue.
Dr. Jackson, I don't know if you have these results or not, but it says in the 17th Congressional District, which is in Western Illinois, Quad Cities, Peoria, Rockford area, during the 2016 presidential election, Democrat Sherry Bustos had retained her seat, even though the district had voted for Trump. In the 2020 election, Congresswoman Bustos won re-election again, but which way did the district vote for president? Trump again or Biden?
I think the district voted for Trump again, and I would be surprised if it didn't. She was in one of those districts where they were precarious, and a number of them did lose. Of course, her margin went down fairly significantly as she was fighting the fight for the National Party, leader of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and that may have caused her not to be able to do as much work in her own district right there. But that's a typical, the losses the Democrats sustained in the House, as I understand them currently, are in exactly those districts, like Congresswoman Bustos.
And Dr. Jackson, what do you think about the highly partisan offices at the county level? It seems to me that positions such as county treasurer, county clerk, et cetera, require a high level of skill and knowledge, and we're not well served by a frequent transition based on election. Could we have appointed officials in those county positions?
You could have. Some states are going more toward that direction. It is one of those reform movements that has not caught on in Illinois because we've always had not only county officials separately elected, but also county officials running on partisan ballots. I'm guessing that's going to be very hard to change in Illinois.
If Pfizer would have announced their COVID vaccine 2 weeks earlier, would the outcome for the president have been different?
I don't think it would have been enough to change it because it's still over the horizon. It would have been certainly a PR boost for the president, and he would have been quite loud about it in terms of talking about that he knew what he was doing all the time. I don't think it would fundamentally have changed the outcome.
And someone mentioned, I don't know if you want to get into this, but someone said that most people don't get 100% pension. So how is that justified?
I'm not clear. Most people don't get 100% pensions, meaning as opposed to their last pay rate. Is that what that means?
I'm not sure, Dr. Jackson. If that person wants to submit a little more information as to what they're asking, we can come back to that. I think I have covered what's been submitted. If anyone has anything else they'd like to ask, feel free to include those questions in the chat box and we can get through those in the last little bit of time we have remaining. Dr. Jackson, I just wanted to, you mentioned earlier about Justice Kilbride, and I now live in that judicial district, and I would definitely say that the mailings that we received and the TV ads that were putting him and Madigan together, I'm sure that had some kind of impact on his results, because there must have been a lot of money put into that, I would say.
Yeah, that seems apparent that the Republicans very effectively carried that message against both Justice Kilbride and against graduated income tax. I think it was a big part of the defeat in both cases. It was one of those cases where campaigns did make a difference and where PR and money spent on television and social media did make a difference. We have a long debate in my discipline and in journalism about do the campaigns make a difference or not. I think this is a case where clearly they did, and the Republicans got their message out more effectively.
Back to that pension question. It is my understanding there are state groups that get 100% pension while the rest of the people get 401ks and some have nothing. How do we justify that discrepancy? Like groups of state employees?
Well, that's a long-term debate also. State employees across the country typically have the kind of pension system that we have in Illinois. Private enterprise does more often have 401ks. And of course, that's been the Republican talking points that why should public employees get those better pensions? Public employees would answer, they make less money overall for comparable work than private enterprise, depending on where you are in the hierarchy. At higher level job categories, that is true. That is, private enterprise in higher level, higher demand, higher educated jobs make more than public employees do. But public employees make up for some of that with probably a more secure pension system. But that whole thing is under attack and under debate and would be a part of a change if we open the constitutional provision, which a number of people advocate that debate takes place.
As a follow-up to that, someone asked if we would be able to change the automatic 3% pension increase every year for educators and others.
If we would be able to what? Say again on that.
If we would be able to change the automatic 3% pension increase every year for educators and others.
Oh, that's exactly the objective for those who want to reopen the contract clause according to the Illinois Supreme Court, is absolutely clear on that in terms of what the decision that Judge Carmeier wrote, the unanimous decision of the court just 2 years ago, I think it was. So you've got to have a constitutional amendment. And if you go that route, it's going to absolutely be directed toward the 3% increase.
Dr. Jackson, do you see significance based on age of the voter? Did more younger people vote? Did that influence the election?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the good news items coming out of this election. Young people have traditionally been the lowest age cohort by considerable magnitude in terms of turnout. They probably didn't catch up this year, but they did a big step forward because young people did get excited, they got mobilized, and they turned out. So that's a good news item.
Dr. Jackson.
And it will change. I think it will change our politics when that generation comes on. I think there's no question about that. And they are, to state the obvious, they are the future, and the parties have got to start moving and dealing with that generation.
Dr. Jackson, as you and maybe your colleagues at SIU Carbondale have reported, rural Illinois is a net recipient of tax dollars from the state. And yet many residents complain about Chicago and having a sense that they are not getting their fair share. Furthermore, I suspect that a majority of rural residents voted against the progressive income tax amendment, which would have benefited most of these rural residents. It appears that rural residents vote against their own self-interest. Is that true in your view?
Well, you can look at the map. I mentally looked through all of the returns, and it's clear that I think there was only Cook County, maybe one of the suburban counties, that voted for the progressive income tax. So the writer of that question is right. The rural areas, Southern Illinois, heavily rejected the graduated income tax, and so did Central and Northern Illinois, for that matter.
Just a reminder for folks that there is a poll open. If folks could respond to that poll and take a look at other responses. We did have a few different thank yous, Dr. Jackson, for sharing the information and great discussion. I believe we've gotten through the questions at this point. Do you have anything you'd like to finish off with, Dr. Jackson, or have you covered it?
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you folks. I enjoyed making the presentation and hearing the questions. And I looked at the roster. It's an impressive group of people at the grassroots doing public service and doing important nonprofit work and educational work across the state. So I feel privileged to be asked by this large and diverse group representing two great universities and the good work that you do for rural Illinois. So I very much enjoyed the presentation and the feedback.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And I know that when we asked you to do this a few months ago, like you said, you probably thought things might be a little bit more complete by this point. So.
Yeah, right.
All right. So again, thank you all for being here. I did want to mention that I did include the Rural Partners website in the chat box in case anyone's interested in learning more about Rural Partners. And I don't know if we have Ann or Nancy, if there's anything else that needs to be mentioned before we wrap up.
This is Ann. I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Jackson. This was a great specific look at what happened in Illinois and how those national results affect us. And I really appreciate your willingness to give us a lot of information and then also field a lot of questions. So thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, we're grateful to have you as a resource.
Thank you.